$50 does not sound like much, not today and not even back then. But on the Montana frontier, when the wind carried dust instead of promises and every sunrise felt like a wager against hunger, $50 could mean the difference between staying and leaving, between hope and surrender, between two strangers passing by or two lives tying together in ways neither could undo. The town of Red Willow sat under a wide sky that never seemed to end. Wooden storefronts lined the main street, their paint faded by years of hard winters and harsh summers. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, tails swatting flies, while men in worn hats leaned against porch rails and talked in low voices about cattle prices and railroads that might or might not reach them one day. It was the kind of place where everyone knew who had come in on the morning stagecoach and who had not paid their tab at the saloon. She arrived on a wagon that looked like it had crossed half the country, which in truth it had. Her dress was plain and mended at the hem, the blue cloth faded from too many washings in cold river water. She stood straight, though, as if refusing to let the long miles bend her spirit. There was a quiet strength about her that made people look twice. Not because she was loud or bold, but because she seemed to carry something heavier than her small trunk and still would not let it show. The man who noticed her first was not standing on a porch or leaning in a doorway. He was in the saddle, guiding a chestnut horse through the middle of town, dust rising in soft clouds around the animal's hooves. He had the look of someone who had spent more nights under the open sky than beneath a roof. His hat was pulled low, and his jacket had seen years of wind and rain. Folks knew him as a ranch hand who kept mostly to himself. He worked hard, spoke little, and trusted few. Their eyes met only for a second. That was all it took to mark the moment. She had come to Red Willow for work. Her father had passed the previous winter, leaving behind little more than debts and a small piece of land that could not feed her and her younger brother. The land had been sold, the money barely enough for train fare west and a wagon ride north. She had heard that Montana was a place where a person could start over if they were willing to work hard and keep their head down. What she did not know was that starting over often cost more than anyone expected. By the time the sun dipped low behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the dirt road, she had learned one hard truth. The boarding house wanted payment in advance. 2 weeks, no exceptions. The woman who ran it was not cruel, just careful. Food cost money. Wood for the stove cost money. Everything cost money, $50. It might as well have been $500. She had only a few coins in her pocket and a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Selling it would break her heart, but even that would not bring in $50. So she stood outside the general store, her hands clasped together, trying to think of a way forward in a town that did not yet feel like home. Across the street, the ranch hand watched her again. He had seen that look before. He had worn it himself when he first came to Montana with nothing but a bedroll and a promise of wages that never quite stretched far enough. He knew what it meant to count coins twice and still come up short. He told himself it was none of his concern. Everyone in Red Willow had their own troubles. Winter would come soon enough, and he needed to save what he had earned from the cattle drive. There were repairs to make on the small cabin he rented at the edge of town. There was always something that needed fixing. Yet he did not ride away. Instead, he dismounted and tied his horse to the post outside the store. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. He bought a sack of flour he did not need just to give himself time to think. When he came back out, she was still there, staring down the road as if hoping an answer might appear in the dust. He cleared his throat, not used to beginning conversations. She turned, her eyes cautious but steady. "You looking for work?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice was soft but not weak. "I can cook, sew, clean. I can read and write. I learn fast." He nodded. Those were useful skills, but this was ranch country. Most families did their own mending and cooking. Jobs was scarce, especially for someone new. "The boarding house asked for payment up front," he said, though it was more a statement than a question. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. He reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against the folded bills he had been saving. $50. It was nearly all he had set aside after months of hard labor. He had planned to use it to buy a small piece of land one day, something to call his own. A start, a future. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind moved between them, lifting a strand of her dark hair across her cheek. She pushed it back with a quiet dignity that made something tighten in his chest. "This ain't charity," he said at last, his voice firm. "You can pay me back when you're able, with work or money. Don't matter." Her eyes widened slightly as he held out the bills. She did not take them right away. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the truth. Because he knew what it was to stand alone. Because something about her felt like a turning point he did not yet understand. Because sometimes a person just knows. "Call it an investment," he said. After a pause that felt longer than it was, she reached out and took the money. Her fingers brushed his, and the contact was brief but steady, like a promise neither of them had spoken aloud. That $50 bought her a small room at the boarding house and a chance to breathe. It also bought him something he had not expected: hope. In the days that followed, she found work helping at the schoolhouse during the week and mending clothes for ranch families in the evenings. Word spread quickly that her stitches were neat and her prices fair. She worked until her hands ached, determined not to owe anyone longer than necessary. He saw her often after that, sometimes at the well, drawing water, sometimes at the edge of town, watching the sunset as if measuring her place in this wide land. They spoke in short exchanges at first about weather and work, about the stubborn mule that belonged to the boarding house and the rumor of a new rail line pushing west. But beneath those simple conversations, something deeper was taking root. Montana had a way of testing people. A late frost could ruin crops, a sudden storm could scatter cattle. Trust was not given lightly, and love even less so. Yet there was a quiet understanding growing between them, built on shared glances and small acts of kindness. The townsfolk began to notice, some approved. A hardworking ranch hand and a determined young woman seemed a fitting pair for frontier life. Others whispered that it was foolish to lend money to a stranger, that $50 could disappear as quickly as it had been given. He heard the whispers and let them pass. He had not asked for praise. He had not asked for advice. What he had not expected was trouble to follow so soon. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of gold and the smell of supper drifted from open windows, a rider came into town fast, his horse lathered with sweat. He carried news that made every conversation stop. The ranch where he worked was in danger. A claim had been filed by an Eastern investor who said the land belonged to him. Papers had been signed years ago, and now the ranch owner was being forced to prove his right to stay. If he failed, the land would be taken, the cattle sold, the hands dismissed, including him. The news spread like wildfire. Men gathered in tight circles, voices low and tense. Jobs were scarce enough without losing one of the largest ranches in the county. For him, it meant more than wages. It meant losing the dream he had been quietly building, the future he had started to imagine with her somewhere in it. She found him standing near the stable, his horse untacked but forgotten. The weight in his eyes told her everything before he spoke. "You might not be here much longer," she said softly. "Looks that way." They stood side by side, the evening air cool against their skin. The $50 between them had once felt like a burden she needed to repay. Now it felt like the smallest part of something far greater. "If you leave," she said, "I will still owe you." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything," but they both knew that was not true. They owed each other something unspoken: trust, faith, the courage to believe in a future neither could see clearly. As darkness settled over Red Willow, a new fear crept in. If the ranch was lost, he would have to ride out to find work elsewhere. And if he left, would he return? Would the fragile bond between them survive distance and time? Or would it fade like footprints in the dust? The $50 that had once seemed like a simple act of kindness now stood at the center of a storm. It had tied their fates together in ways neither had planned. It had opened a door neither was ready to close. And by morning, when the layer from back east was set to arrive with his papers and his polished boots, one choice would have to be made: stand and fight for a place in Montana, or walk away before the land and the love it held slipped through their fingers forever. By morning, Red Willow did not feel like the same town. The air was colder, sharper, as if the wind itself had heard the news and decided to wait and watch. Men gathered outside the mercantile before it even opened. Women stood in small groups along the boardwalk, speaking in hushed tones. Even the horses seemed restless, shifting their weight and tossing their heads as though they sensed that something bigger than a simple land dispute was about to unfold. He had not slept much. The small cabin at the edge of town felt tighter than usual, the walls closing in with every thought of what might come. If the Eastern investor proved his claim, the ranch would fall, the cattle would be auctioned off. The men would scatter across Montana looking for work that did not exist. Winter was close, and the frontier did not forgive the unprepared. He saddled his horse before sunrise and rode into town without thinking much about it. He told himself he needed to hear the details firsthand. He told himself it was just business. But when he reached the main street, his eyes searched for her without meaning to. She was standing near the schoolhouse steps, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The children had not arrived yet. No one knew if lessons would even continue if families were forced to move. She looked smaller in the pale morning light, but her posture was steady. When she saw him, she walked down to meet him in the dirt road. "They say the lawyer came in on the first train," she said quietly. He nodded. Staying at the hotel? There was something unsettling about that. The hotel in Red Willow was modest, with uneven floors and thin walls, but to the town it was a symbol of progress. Outsiders stayed there, investors, surveyors, men who looked at the land not as home, but as numbers on paper. "Do you believe the claim is real?" she asked. He hesitated. "I believe men with money don't ride all the way out here without thinking they'll get something in return." That answer did not comfort either of them. The ranch owner was not a greedy man. He had built his spread from almost nothing, starting with a handful of cattle and a borrowed fence line. Over the years, he had hired men who needed work and treated them fair. He paid on time. He allowed credit at the store when times were tight. If his land was truly under threat, it meant something had gone wrong long ago. As the sun rose higher, the lawyer appeared. He stepped out of the hotel dressed in a dark coat too heavy for the season and boots that had never touched mud until that morning. He carried a leather case under his arm and looked around with thinly veiled disapproval. His eyes moved over the storefronts, the dusty street, the people who paused mid-sentence to stare at him. The ranch owner approached first, his shoulders broad but tense. A few of the ranch hands, including him, stayed close behind. The rest of the town watched from a distance, pretending not to listen. The lawyer spoke in a calm voice that carried further than it should have. He mentioned documents signed 15 years ago. He spoke of unpaid debts and contractual obligations. He said the Eastern investor had acquired the rights legally and intended to take possession within 30 days unless payment was made in full. Payment, the number he stated, felt heavier than any storm cloud. It was more than the ranch owner could gather in a month, more than most of Red Willow would see in years. The figure hung in the air, unmovable. She had edged closer without realizing it. Standing behind the group, she caught fragments of the conversation. Words like foreclosure, lien auction, words that did not belong in a town built on handshakes and long days under open skies. When the meeting ended, nothing was settled. The lawyer returned to the hotel, leaving behind a silence that pressed down on everyone. The ranch owner turned to his men. "We fight it," he said simply. "I'll ride to Helena if I have to. I'll find every paper we ever signed." There was resolve in his voice, but also strain. He found her again near the well. The bucket rope creaked as she pulled it up, the sound steady and familiar against the uncertainty of the day. "If the ranch closes," she said without looking at him, "you will have to leave." "Yes, and you would go far." "As far as the work takes me." She nodded slowly. She had come to Montana to build something solid. The thought of watching it slip away frightened her more than she wanted to admit. He leaned against the wooden frame of the well. "I might be able to send money back," he said. "If you still need it." She looked up sharply. "I will repay what I owe. It was never about that." "I know," her voice softened. "But I need to stand on my own feet. Out here, that matters." He understood. Pride was not vanity on the frontier, it was survival. Over the next few days, the tension in Red Willow grew. Riders came and went with letters. The ranch owner searched through old ledgers stored in a shed that smelled of dust and oil. Men gathered in the evenings to discuss options, their boots scuffing the ground as they paced. Some believed the investor would back down if the town stood united. Others feared that unity meant little against stamped documents in city courts. There were rumors that the investor planned to sell the land to a railroad company, turning pasture into track. The thought unsettled many. The railroad promised progress, more goods, faster travel, but it also brought strangers and change that could not be controlled. Red Willow was small, but it was theirs. Through it all, she continued her work. She rose before dawn to prepare lessons for the children who still came. She mended torn sleeves and patched worn trousers for families who might soon be packing their belongings. She counted her earnings at night, stacking coins carefully on the small table in her room. The $50 weighed on her mind in a new way. It had given her shelter, it had allowed her to stay. But now, as she watched him ride long hours with worry carved into his face, she felt the imbalance more sharply. One evening, she made a decision that scared her. She walked to the hotel. The building felt different from the rest of town, quieter and colder. The lobby smelled of polished wood and unfamiliar cologne. The lawyer sat at a small desk near the window, reading by lamplight. He looked up when she approached, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I hope so," she replied. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her voice steady. She asked about the claim, about the amount owed, about whether there was any room for negotiation. She spoke not as a lawyer or a landowner, but as someone who understood what the ranch meant to the town. The lawyer listened, his fingers steepled. When she finished, he gave a measured response. The debt was clear. The law was clear. If the money was paid, the land would remain. If not, possession would change hands. But what if part of it was paid? She pressed. Would that not show good faith? He regarded her carefully. Good faith does not erase contracts. She left the hotel with her heart pounding. She had learned little, except that the investor was firm and that time was short. He found out about her visit the next day. Word traveled fast in Red Willow, and someone had seen her enter the hotel. He confronted her near the schoolhouse, his concern plain. "You shouldn't have gone alone," he said. "I am not made of glass," she replied, though she understood his worry. "That man doesn't see this town the way we do." "Then someone has to remind him," she said quietly. Their eyes met, and for a moment the land dispute faded. What stood between them was not just fear of losing work. It was the realization that their futures were tied to forces larger than either of them. In the following week, another layer of uncertainty emerged. An older ranch hand, one who had been with the owner since the early days, claimed to remember a different version of the original agreement. He spoke of a payment that had been made in cattle rather than cash. He insisted that the investor's predecessor had accepted it. But there was no written proof, only memory. Memory did not hold up in court. Still, the possibility stirred hope. If the payment could be proven, the claim might weaken. The ranch owner began searching for witnesses, men who had moved on years ago. Letters were written and sent across Montana and beyond. Each day felt longer than the last. She continued to save her earnings, but she also began quietly speaking with families in town. A few offered small amounts to support the ranch owner's legal fight. Not enough to cover the debt, but enough to show solidarity. When he learned of this, his chest tightened with both pride and fear. "You don't have to carry this," he told her one evening as they walked along the edge of town where the prairie opened wide. "I am not carrying it alone," she said. "We all are." The sky above them was streaked with red and gold, beautiful and indifferent. The wind moved through the tall grass, bending it in waves. "What if it isn't enough?" he asked. She did not answer right away. "Then we decide what kind of people we are," she said finally. "Do we leave when things get hard, or do we stand and see it through?" He looked at her, seeing not just the woman who had stepped off a wagon with nothing but a trunk and a quiet resolve, but someone who had become part of the heartbeat of Red Willow. Yet the deadline crept closer. 30 days sounded long at first. Now, nearly half of them were gone. The lawyer remained in town, writing letters by lamplight and riding out to inspect the boundaries of the ranch. Survey stakes began appearing along the far edge of the pasture, thin wooden markers that felt like warnings. Each time he rode past them, a knot formed in his stomach. One evening, as he returned from checking cattle, he noticed something unusual near the old fence line. A small wooden box, half buried in dirt as if recently uncovered by shifting soil. He dismounted, curiosity overcoming fatigue. The box was weathered and locked, its surface marked with faint initials he could not quite make out in the fading light. He glanced toward the ranch house in the distance, then back at the box. If it held old records, it could change everything. Or it could hold nothing at all. With the wind rising and dusk settling fast, he lifted the box into his saddlebag, unaware that someone had been watching from the tree line beyond the fence. He did not open the box right away. The weight of it sat heavy in his saddlebag as he rode back toward the ranch house, the sky darkening behind him. Every sound seemed sharper than usual, the creak of leather, the steady rhythm of hooves, the wind brushing through dry grass. And somewhere behind those sounds was the quiet feeling that someone else knew about the box. When he reached the barn, he unsaddled his horse slowly, forcing himself not to look over his shoulder. The other ranch hands were finishing their chores, their voices low and tired. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. He carried the box into the small bunkhouse and set it on his cot. The wood was cracked at one corner, the metal lock rusted but still firm. He ran his thumb over the faint initials carved into the top. They were worn by time, almost erased by weather, but they looked older than anything from recent years. If this box had been buried near the fence line, it could have been there for a long time. Long enough to belong to the early days of the ranch. He fetched a small tool from his trunk and worked at the lock carefully. It took patience. He did not want to damage what might be inside. After several minutes, the lock gave way with a dull snap. He lifted the lid. Inside were folded papers wrapped in oilcloth, yellowed with age but protected from moisture. His heart pounded as he unfolded the first sheet. It was a receipt, not for cash but for livestock. The date was close to the year the lawyer had mentioned. The signature at the bottom was faded, but it matched the name of the investor's predecessor. He swallowed hard. If this receipt was genuine, it could support the old ranch hand's memory. It could show that payment had been made in cattle, not money, that the debt had already been settled. But why would something so important be buried and forgotten? He read through the rest of the papers. There were more receipts, a short letter written in hurried script, and what looked like a draft of an agreement. The language was rough, not polished like the lawyer's documents, but it spoke clearly of an exchange. The door to the bunkhouse creaked open. He quickly folded the papers back into the oilcloth and closed the lid. One of the younger ranch hands stepped inside, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the young man said. "Just tired," he replied, keeping his voice steady. Later that night, he rode into town. He needed someone who could read the documents carefully, someone who understood more than cattle and fence posts. He thought of her immediately. Her room at the boarding house was lit by a small lamp when he knocked. She opened the door with surprise on her face, then concern when she saw his expression. "What happened?" she asked. "Something you need to see." She let him in. The room was small but neat. A simple bed against one wall, a wooden chair. A table covered in neatly stacked papers and sewing supplies. He set the box on the table and opened it carefully. She leaned closer, her brow furrowed as she examined the documents. "These look old," she murmured. "They were buried near the fence." She lifted one of the receipts and read it slowly. Her finger traced the date. The amount of livestock listed was significant. "If this is real," she said softly, "it changes everything." He watched her as she read, noticing how her face shifted between hope and caution. She was not the kind of person to let excitement cloud her thinking. "The lawyer will say it is incomplete," she added, "or that it was never finalized. There's a letter here," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it gently. The handwriting was uneven, but clear enough. It spoke of agreement, of settlement in full through cattle delivered before winter. It mentioned witnesses by first name only. She looked up at him. "We need to show this to the ranch owner first thing in the morning." He nodded, but something still bothered him. "Someone was watching," he said quietly. She paused. "Watching you, I felt it." Near the trees. Her gaze shifted toward the window, though the curtains were drawn. "Do you think it was one of the investor's men?" "I don't know. But if this box was meant to stay hidden, someone might not want it found." The discovery spread quickly the next day, though they tried to keep it quiet. The ranch owner's hands trembled slightly as he read through the papers. The older ranch hand who had spoken of cattle payments stared at the receipt for a long time before nodding slowly. "That's the mark," he said. "That's his signature," hope flickered across tired faces. But hope on the frontier was fragile. The layer was summoned to the ranch house that afternoon. He arrived with the same composed expression, though a hint of irritation showed at being called away from his desk. The documents were laid out before him. He examined them carefully, adjusting his spectacles. The room felt tight, every breath measured. "These are interesting," he admitted after a long silence. "Interesting is not enough," the ranch owner replied. "They show payment. They show an exchange was discussed," the lawyer corrected calmly. "But whether it was legally binding is another matter." The tension in the room thickened. "The letter mentions settlement in full," she said, unable to remain silent. "It names witnesses." "Yes," the lawyer said, "first names only. Without full identification, it will be difficult to prove their testimony." "They are real men," the older ranch hand insisted. "I worked beside them, and where are they now?" the lawyer asked gently. No one answered. Montana was wide, men moved on. Some followed gold, some followed rail lines. Some disappeared into the mountains and were never heard from again. The lawyer closed the folder. "I will send copies to my client. He will review them. But I advise you not to assume this resolves the debt." The words felt like cold water. After he left, the ranch owner paced the floor. "If we can find even one of those witnesses," he said, "it strengthens our case." Letters were written that night, more urgent than before. Riders were sent toward nearby towns to ask around. The search for men who might not even be alive had begun. Meanwhile, whispers in Red Willow took a different turn. Some townsfolk began to question how the box had remained hidden for so long. Others wondered who might have buried it. A few suggested that someone had deliberately kept the evidence from view. She heard the murmurs while walking back from the schoolhouse. Two women near the well lowered their voices as she approached. The word investor drifted through the air. So did the word bribe? When she reached him that evening, she shared what she had heard. "If someone hid that box on purpose," she said, "it means this fight started long before we knew." He stared out at the prairie. "Or someone wanted to keep it safe until the right time." "Why now?" she asked. He did not have an answer. The subplot of the hidden box added another layer to the conflict. It was no longer just about a land claim. It was about trust and memory and the possibility that someone in the past had tried to protect the ranch from exactly this moment. As days passed, pressure mounted. The investor sent a telegram, brief and firm. The documents would be reviewed, but the deadline remained unchanged. Payment or transfer of land. Survey stakes multiplied along the pasture. Strangers were seen riding the perimeter, measuring distances with long chains. The sight unsettled the cattle, who bunched nervously near familiar fences. He found himself riding longer hours, checking boundaries as if his presence alone could hold the land in place. One afternoon, while returning from the far edge of the ranch, he spotted movement near the tree line where he had found the box. This time, he did not ignore it. He guided his horse quietly toward the area. A figure stepped out from behind the trees. It was not one of the investor's men. It was a young ranch hand from a neighboring spread, someone who had once worked under the same owner years ago. "You were there the other night?" he said evenly. The young man hesitated, then nodded. "I saw you dig something up. Why didn't you come forward?" "I wasn't sure what you'd found," the young man replied. "But I know my father talked about missing papers before he died. Said some folks wanted certain things forgotten." The words hung in the air. "Who?" he asked. The young man looked toward town, then back at him. "I don't know. But my father believed the original agreement was honest. He always said the land was paid for." That added another thread to the growing web. Back in town, she faced her own challenge. The boarding house owner pulled her aside one evening. "You've been spending time at the ranch," the woman said carefully. "Yes, you need to be cautious. People are talking. They say you are stirring things up with that lawyer." She felt a flash of frustration. "I'm asking questions." "That is not a crime." "No," the woman agreed. But in a small town, questions can divide people. She understood the warning. If the ranch fell, blame would be cast, lines would be drawn. She could not afford to be seen as reckless, especially when her place in Red Willow was still new. Yet she could not step back now. That night she counted her savings again. The small stack of coins had grown, but it was nowhere near the amount demanded. Even if every family in town contributed, they would struggle to reach it. $50 had once felt life-changing. Now they were facing a sum that could break an entire community. As the deadline approached, tension tightened like a rope pulled too far. The lawyer remained calm, almost distant, but there were moments when she caught him studying the town with something like curiosity, as if he were measuring not just land, but resolve. The hidden box, the buried receipts, the missing witnesses, the rumors of forgotten payments, the threat of foreclosure and railroad expansion, all of it swirled together into one looming question. Was Red Willow built on solid ground or on a promise that had never been fully secured? And somewhere beneath that question lay another. If the land was taken and he was forced to ride away, would the fragile bond formed by a simple $50 survive the distance? Or would Montana claim another story of love lost to dust and legal papers? The wind rose again that evening, carrying with it the scent of coming change. The final week before the deadline felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with the ground slowly crumbling beneath their boots. Red Willow no longer moved at its usual pace. The rhythm of ranch life was still there, cattle still needed tending, fences still needed mending, but everything carried a strain that could be felt in the smallest gestures. Conversation stopped when a stranger walked by. Doors closed a little quicker at night. Even the children at the schoolhouse seemed to sense the tension, their laughter softer, their eyes searching the adults for answers. The ranch owner had sent riders in every direction. 2 had returned with nothing but tired horses and stories of men who had moved on years ago. 1 rider had not yet come back, and each sunset without news tightened the knot in everyone's chest. The hidden box remained at the center of their hope. Copies of the old receipt and the letter had been made carefully and delivered to the lawyer. The original papers were stored in a locked drawer at the ranch house, guarded as closely as any herd of cattle. But the investor's telegram arrived again, brief and cold. The documents were under review, but no formal recognition had been granted. The deadline stood firm. Payment or transfer of land. Those words echoed through town like a warning bell. She found herself walking more often along the stretch of prairie that overlooked the ranch. The wind moved freely there, bending the tall grass in long waves that shimmered under the Montana sun. It was beautiful land, strong land, the kind that held memories in its soil. The thought of survey stakes turning into railroad tracks made her chest ache. He joined her one evening, his boots dusty from a long ride. "They were measuring again today," he said quietly. "Closer to the north pasture." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Do they act certain? They act like it already belongs to them?" The idea cut deeper than either of them expected. They walked in silence for a while, the sky painted in orange and deep blue. Finally, he spoke the fear neither had fully said out loud. "If this goes through, I will have to leave fast. There won't be time for long goodbyes." She stopped walking. "I know." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if trying to memorize the way the wind lifted strands of her hair, the steady set of her jaw, the quiet strength that had first caught his attention the day she stepped off that wagon. "That $50, he said slowly. "I never thought it would lead here." She let out a faint breath that was almost a laugh. "Neither did I. It was just money. It was a chance," she corrected gently. "A chance to stay, a chance to work, a chance to build something in Montana instead of running from hardship." Now that chance felt fragile again. In town, tensions between neighbors began to surface. A few families who depended on trade with the railroad argued that expansion could bring prosperity. Others feared it would swallow Red Willow whole. The general store became a place of debate as much as business. One afternoon, raised voices spilled out onto the boardwalk. The ranch owner stood firm, insisting the land had been paid for in full years ago. A merchant countered that legal papers mattered more than memory. The lawyer watched from the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. She stood nearby, listening, feeling the town split along invisible lines. Later that evening she returned to her room and unfolded the old letter again. She had copied it word for word in her careful handwriting, studying every line. One phrase caught her eye in a way it had not before. It mentioned delivery before winter and settlement witnessed at the river crossing. The river crossing. She had passed that spot more than once since arriving in Red Willow. It was a narrow place where wagons could ford when the water ran low. If the settlement had been witnessed there, perhaps someone in town had been present, even if their name was not written. The next morning she sought out the oldest residence she could find. A widow who had lived in Red Willow since its founding. A retired blacksmith whose memory wandered but sharpened when speaking of the early years. She asked careful questions about cattle drives and agreements made near the river. Most shook their heads at first. Then the blacksmith paused, his brow furrowing. "I remember a day," he said slowly. "Cattle lined up by the water. Men arguing about numbers. A handshake that lasted longer than usual." Her heart began to race. "Do you remember who was there?" she asked. "Your ranch owner was young then," he said. "And the other fellow, the one from back east, he looked nervous, like he didn't trust the dirt under his boots." "Was there anyone else?" she pressed. He closed his eyes, searching his memory. "There was a boy helping count the herd. Belonged to the Miller family, I think. The Miller family." She knew that name. They had moved south years ago after a bad harvest. That afternoon she told him everything. "If we can find that family," she said, her voice trembling with urgency, "maybe someone remembers. Maybe someone can confirm what happened at the river crossing." He felt the spark of hope again, but it was tempered by reality. "They could be hundreds of miles away. I know. But it's something," he admitted. He rode out before dawn the next day, heading toward a neighboring town where he had heard the Millers might have settled for a time. The journey would take 2 days at least, and every hour mattered. She watched him disappear down the road, dust rising behind his horse, and felt the weight of waiting settle on her shoulders. Back in Red Willow, the layer received word from his client. The documents from the box were being examined, but authenticity needed to be verified. Handwriting compared. Ink dated, it would take time. Time they did not have. Survey stakes crept closer again, this time near the barn. The sight of them so near the heart of the ranch made even the most patient men clench their fists. The ranch owner called a meeting in the open yard. Every hand, every neighbor, even those who had argued for the railroad, gathered. "We stand together," he said. "We present every piece of evidence. We show them this land was paid for. And if we lose knowing we did not bow without trying." There was a murmur of agreement, though fear still lingered beneath it. That night she sat by the window of her small room, staring out at the darkened street. The boarding house was quiet. She thought about the first night she had stood outside the general store with nothing but a few coins. $50 had felt impossible then. Now she was fighting for something much larger than money. A soft knock sounded at her door. The boarding house owner stood there, her face serious. "There's been talk," the woman said. "The investor may arrive himself before the deadline. He wants to see the land in person." The news hit hard. An investor from back east stepping onto Montana soil meant finality, it meant decision. The next morning, clouds rolled in low and gray, pressing down on the town. A train whistle echoed in the distance, longer and sharper than usual. He returned just before noon, his horse lathered and tired. She ran to meet him near the edge of town. "I found them," he said, breathless. "The Millers moved farther south, but I caught up with one of the sons. And," she urged, "he remembers the river crossing. He remembers counting cattle. He says his father told him the debt was settled that day." Her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fresh anxiety. "Will he come?" "He agreed to ride back with me. He should arrive by tomorrow." Tomorrow, the same day, the investor was expected. As if on cue, a carriage rolled into town late that afternoon. It was finer than anything Red Willow had seen in months. A well-dressed man stepped out, his coat crisp, his boots polished. The investor. He looked around with keen interest, taking in the storefronts, the ranch hands, the wide Montana sky. His gaze lingered on the distant pastures as if measuring their worth in more than dollars. The lawyer greeted him formally. Words were exchanged in low tones. By evening, it was clear that a formal meeting would be held at the ranch house the following day. All evidence would be presented, all claims reviewed. The entire town felt suspended between hope and loss. She stood beside him outside the ranch house as lanterns were lit along the porch. The wind had calmed, leaving the air still and heavy. "Tomorrow decides everything," she said. He nodded. "No matter what happens, I don't regret that day." "What day?" "The day I handed you $50. She turned toward him, her heart beating fast. "That money changed my life," she said softly. "Not just because it paid for a room, because it tied me to this place. To this fight." Footsteps approached across the yard, interrupting them. The lawyer was calling for final preparations. The investor wanted to inspect the land at first light before the meeting. Night settled over Red Willow with an uneasy quiet. Lanterns flickered. Doors closed. Prayers were whispered behind thin walls. In the darkness beyond the fence line, the survey stakes stood like silent warnings. At dawn, the investor would ride out across the pasture. By midday, arguments would be made, documents examined, witnesses heard. The old receipt from the hidden box, the memory of the river crossing, the testimony of the miller's son, all of it would hang in the balance. And as the first pale hint of morning touched the horizon, she realized that whatever happened next would not only decide the fate of a Montana ranch. It would decide whether a simple act of kindness, $50 offered in faith, had truly been the beginning of something that could endure every storm. Dawn came slow and pale over the Montana prairie, as if even the sun was unsure about what the day would bring. The investor rode out just after first light, flanked by the lawyer and the ranch owner. Several ranch hands followed at a distance, including him. She stood near the fence line at first, watching the small group move across the pasture, their figures framed against the wide sky that had witnessed every struggle in Red Willow. The land looked different that morning. The frost clung to the grass, sparkling in quiet defiance. The cattle grazed in slow, steady motions, unaware of contracts and court claims. The survey stakes still marked the edges, thin pieces of wood that seemed out of place against the open range. The investor dismounted near the river crossing. She felt her breath catch. From where she stood, she could see the faint path worn into the ground where wagons had once passed. It was there, years ago, that cattle had been counted and an agreement had been made. It was there that memory and paper now collided. Voices drifted across the distance but were carried away by the wind. After a time, the group turned back toward the ranch house. The real decision would be made indoors, with documents spread across a table instead of cattle standing in a line. By mid-morning, the ranch house was full. The investor sat at the head of the long wooden table, composed but attentive. The lawyer had laid out every document in careful order. The old receipt from the hidden box rested beside the more formal contract the investor carried. The letter mentioning settlement at the river crossing lay open, its faded ink a silent plea from the past. The miller's son arrived just before the meeting began. Dust covered his coat from the long ride, but his eyes were clear and steady. He shook hands with the ranch owner and nodded respectfully toward the others before taking his place near the table. She stood near the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm beside hers. Neither spoke, but the weight of the moment pressed against them both. The lawyer began by restating the claim. The original contract, signed years ago, had outlined a debt to be paid in installments. According to the investor's records, the final payment had never been received. Therefore, ownership of the Montana ranch was in question. The ranch owner then presented the hidden box and its contents, the receipt for livestock, the letter referencing settlement in full, the mention of witnesses at the river crossing. The investor leaned forward, studying the documents again. "And you claim this exchange of cattle satisfied the remaining balance?" he said evenly. "It did," the ranch owner replied. "We delivered every head promised before winter. It was counted. It was accepted." The miller's son stepped forward when called. He spoke in simple words, recalling the day at the river crossing. He described the cattle lined up in the cold air. He described his father counting alongside the ranch owner and the eastern representative. He remembered the handshake that followed and his father saying the debt was finished. "I was young," he admitted. But I remember my father telling my mother that night that the land was paid for. He said it was settled fair. The room fell quiet. The lawyer asked careful questions, testing the memory, pressing for detail. The miller's son did not waver. He admitted what he did not remember and stood firm on what he did. Then the older ranch hand spoke, his voice rough with age. He confirmed the delivery of cattle and the acceptance by the investor's predecessor. He described the relief that followed, the sense that the ranch finally belonged fully to the man who had built it. All eyes turned to the investor. He did not rush his response. He read the letter again, tracing the signature of his predecessor. He compared it to the formal contract. He studied the receipt and asked about the handwriting. The lawyer quietly acknowledged that the signature appeared consistent with other known documents. Outside, the town waited. Men stood in clusters along the fence. Women gathered near the porch. No one wanted to miss the moment that would decide Red Willow's future. Inside, the investor finally set the papers down. My client's interest, he said slowly, was always based on the belief that the final payment had not been made. If these documents and testimonies are accurate, then the debt was indeed settled through livestock. A flicker of hope moved through the room. However, he continued, and the air tightened again, the lack of formal amendment to the original contract created confusion. The ranch owner held his breath. The investor looked around at the faces before him. He glanced out the window toward the pasture where the land stretched wide and unbroken. My predecessor may have accepted the cattle in good faith but failed to record the adjustment properly. That oversight does not erase the reality of what occurred. Silence filled the space. Based on the evidence presented, he said clearly, I recognize the settlement as complete. The land remains with its current owner. For a moment, no one moved. The words seemed almost unreal, as if carried on the same wind that had threatened to sweep everything away. Then the tension broke. The ranch owner let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for years. The older ranch hand closed his eyes briefly in relief. The miller's son nodded once, satisfied that his father's memory had not been lost to time. She felt her knees weaken, and without thinking, she reached for his hand. He held it tightly, not caring who saw. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. A shout rose from the porch, followed by another. Hats were lifted into the air, laughter and tears mingled freely. Red Willow, small and weathered, had held its ground. The investor stood and extended his hand to the ranch owner. I have no wish to claim what has been rightfully earned, he said. Montana is changing. There will be other opportunities. He left that afternoon, his carriage rolling out of town with less certainty than when it had arrived. The lawyer followed soon after, his polished boots finally carrying him away from the dust of Red Willow. By sunset, the survey stakes were being pulled from the ground. He walked beside her toward the river crossing that evening. The prairie seemed brighter somehow, as if the land itself had exhaled. It's over, she said softly. It's settled, he corrected, a faint smile breaking across his face. They stood at the edge of the water where years ago cattle had been counted and a handshake had sealed a promise. The river moved steadily, unchanged by contracts or disputes. I thought I might lose everything, he admitted. You almost did. He turned to face her fully. Not everything, she felt the weight of those words. The $50 that had once seemed like a small act now felt like the thread that had stitched together an entire future. Without it, she would have left town before the conflict even began. Without it, she would not have been there to read the old letter carefully, to ask about the river crossing, to search for the Miller family. You changed more than you know, he said quietly. She shook her head. You gave me a chance. I only followed it. In the days that followed, Red Willow felt renewed. The ranch hands returned to their work with lighter steps. The schoolhouse filled again with children whose families no longer feared sudden departure. The general store buzzed with talk not of foreclosure, but of harvest plans and community gatherings. The miller's son stayed for a few weeks, welcomed as part of the town's history. The older ranch hand found peace knowing that the truth had finally surfaced. Even those who had argued for the railroad admitted that unity had saved something more valuable than land. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Montana horizon, he walked her to the boarding house as he had many times before. But this time there was no shadow of departure between them. I still owe you, she said gently, though her tone carried a hint of playfulness. He smiled. You repaid me long ago. I meant the money. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. Keep it, he said. She looked confused. That $50 bought more than a room, he continued. It bought the start of something neither of us could see yet. Her eyes softened. I want to build something here, he said, his voice steady. Not just fences and barns. A home. The word lingered in the air. Here, she repeated. Here in Montana, in Red Willow. With you, if you'll have it. The wind moved gently between them, no longer sharp with uncertainty. The town behind them glowed in warm lamplight, steady and welcoming. She thought of the long journey that had brought her west, the fear of standing alone with only a few coins, the courage it had taken to accept help, the strength it had taken to fight for land that was not even hers by blood, but had become hers by heart. Yes, she said simply. The word carried more promise than any contract ever could. In the months that followed, a small cabin rose near the edge of the ranch, built by his hands and strengthened by her vision. The land that had nearly been taken became the ground on which their life began. Red Willow continued to grow, but it never forgot the lesson it had learned. That memory matters. That community stands stronger than paper alone. That a simple act of kindness can ripple outward in ways no one expects. And in a town shaped by the Montana frontier, where cattle drives and river crossings once decided fortunes, people would sometimes tell the story of how $50 changed two lives forever. Not because of the money itself, but because of the faith behind it. Under the same wide sky that had watched over their struggle, they built a future rooted in trust, resilience, and love. And that was worth more than any contract could ever claim.